Mabungimbi, ngajino nilawala Anne Poelina, ngayo imarwara manen, ngai mandajara nyigana nganga, ngai nganga jugunyaru buru, and mabungurjin nganga to our mujus. So in my Nyigana language, I said, good morning. We are on Jugunyaru country. Broome is my home, and I am meeting with you all from Broome. So in terms of today, I just want to do something formally because we are opening up a new song line. So when we do that in our culture, we go, so we're waking up the country because the country's been waiting for us. So we're opening up this today, and we're just welcoming all and every one of you that's on this call today, because this is a new songline story, and we want to welcome an acknowledgement of country that there are thousands and thousands of songlines which cross this nation from north to south to east to west, and that these living systems are still alive today. So from that perspective, what we're sharing is a songline, and I want to acknowledge our amazing Indigenous Steering Committee and all the work that we've been doing, but also our bigger, larger committee, which has got so many amazing people on that are coming together from different places, different disciplines, coming in with us to sing and build a new dream and sing a new song in regards to how do we engage in transformational work to create peace with Indigenous people and with nature and with our nation. And then outwardly as global citizens working towards climate change and a just energy transition. So it's a wonderful opportunity to come together today, because what we say as Indigenous people is country and our living water systems are alive and they hold memory. So they hold the memory of all the Indigenous people who have come before us, who will be there in the future and who are with us in the now. So it's a very, very important conversation around the songline story. And I'll give a little later, there'll be a bigger introduction in terms of what the regenerative roadmap is globally. But for us, what we're saying is that this is a chance for our nation to come together. And it is a chance for us to all celebrate together, because this is now your home. Your DNA becomes embedded in this new songline, this new history that we are creating today. So very, very important. And we were just in a way blown away with how many people wanted to come on board today. And we're really, really excited because this is something new, because as Mary and Ross and Mari and all of us work together, what we find is people are leaning towards those things that are going to create hope, where we can build a unity pathway, where we can work together and stand together in unity as Australians. So very, very important that this is an experiment in a way, and it will only work if we all commit to this united pathway. So we believe that in this country in particular, that it is time for justice and equity for Indigenous people. But most importantly, what we are acknowledging is all of those multi-species who are no longer with us today, that we've managed to create into an extinction, if not an endangered list of fellow, in a way, our fellow relatives. So as Indigenous people, we are related to the birds, to the trees, to the sea, to the river, to the mountains. So all of this is very, very important. And so we could not do this work without each of us bringing our strength. So this is about collective wisdom. It is about all of us coming together and sharing our knowledge, because not one human being knows everything in the world. So it's very, very important, particularly for Indigenous leaders, to connect and share our stories. And what we find is that it's all about sameness, not about difference. So there's a brilliant and a wonderful human being called Mary Graham. And she's wonderful. She's, in my culture, I would say, Mary is a woman of high degree. Her every word is considered in each frame to bring meaning into coexistence of human and non-human entities. And she works under a law of obligation, which is about reciprocity, about empathy, about an ethics of care and love. So, I've been following Mary for quite some time, and I just love her work. And I think she's, doing amazing things. And I guess one of the things with Mary, a bit like me, is we don't tend to use a lot of PowerPoint because it's a lived experience. This is a live journey we're taking you on. One, in terms of bringing you into our world, but also exposing you to all of those amazing projects which are yet waiting to be birthed. So from that, I want to introduce Mary, and I'll let her talk to you now. But thank you so much, all of you that have come in and are standing with us today on this nation, singing a new songline, looking for freedom, hope, and empathy, looking not just for Indigenous and justice for nature, but justice for multi-species. So thank you very much, Mary, and it's a great honour to stand side by side with all of our Indigenous leaders on the steering committee, but particularly under you, Mary, and I always default that you are my senior. Thank you.
Unmute. Thank you so much, Anne, for that, and the same back to you. You know, absolutely everything you're saying there. I admire everything you've done, and especially this move, Regenerative Songlines. I think it's timely. It's the perfect thing to do, the right thing to do, and very, very timely, really, after all the time that we've been in, gone through, I mean, the last 200 years or so. So I'll acknowledge my own old mob. On my father's side, I'm speaking from Southport on the Gold Coast. The Yunkaporta speaking language mob, the Kombumerri, my own particular mob, and on my mother's side, Waka Waka, from about 300 or 400 kilometres northwest of here. So I've got lots of relatives all around southeast Queensland in this corner. And I've worked in Aboriginal affairs for a really long time, Aboriginal organisations and so on. And I've learned so much from my own mob, but also Aboriginal people, many people, of course, from a whole lot of other places, all about who we are, where we come from, what the meaning of this country is to all of us, and so on. And starting from that point of view, I suppose, is that it seemed as if one of the main things with our presence here for over such a long period of time, it seemed like the idea of relationality or relationalism comes forward. Two basic relationships, the one between people and land, and then the one between people. And it seemed like the one between people and land is the main one. In other words, the one between people is always contingent on this relationship with land itself. And it starts off, from what I've known and learnt from many people around, is that the land has actually made us. Scientific ideas about how long we've been here in lineal time it's terribly interesting. We're all fascinated by it too, in that way, in the basic curious sort of way. Tens of thousands of years and so on and so on. But when Aboriginal people are asked who we are and where we come from, we always tend to be, and I was told this myself growing up, of course, is that we haven't come from anywhere else. We come from this land. The land literally invented us. It created us. It threw us up, or as I've heard older people say, it grew us up. This land here grew us up and turned us into human beings, basically. And of course, all our ancestors are previous human beings, but also all the other life forms that exist along with us here in this country. So they were here first. So this relationalist view of life, a worldview or Weltanschauung, it comes from this close relationship with what land is, its essence, its spirit, and so on. So, so it invents us. It goes something like this. It invents us. It looks after us. It keeps us human. And that process never ends, actually. Not just in the most basic way, of course, of food and water and shelter and resources and materials and so on and so on. But after, say, several thousand years, the idea becomes quite clear that all meaning of about life and about existence comes from land, from our environment itself. So what builds over this period of time is that what is looking after us, what made us and what is looking after us, we're kind of obliged to look after it. And it is in a straightforward way, a physical materialist way, but especially in a way of looking at land and seeing it for what it is. Actually, it is a great creator, you know. So we're obliged to look after it. So the obligation, the custodial ethic, the obligation to look after it arises. It's invented, you know, it comes out of our experience, and it grows greater and greater and greater. And it becomes more complicated in the sense of complex, I should say, not complicated so much, but complex, as in wherever people have come into the country, come out of the country, I should say, and according to science, coming in and around the people who became Aboriginal in this country, they became human in the places which are most precious to them. Even science itself has said, recent science especially, that the old idea of people being, Aboriginal people being primitive hunter-gatherers, struggling to survive in a harsh, cruel world, has been turned on its head, actually, basically. So it's anything but that. So people have become human in their place. So that means a relationship with it is more than one of simple survival. So we are great survivalists, that's true, but as a philosophy of life, it's not survivalism. It's relationalism, basically. So there's a difference between a relationalist view of life and a survivalist view of life. It's not either or, they are connected, they are intimately connected. Relationalism saves survivalism. It takes care of survivalist tendencies and so on. So you build and build on this relationalist idea. And a relationalist idea is what everybody else is familiar with. Everyday relationalism, family, friends, culture, just life itself. But it also means it includes everything about life that is in to do with conflict too. It's about not getting on. That's relationalism too. Having conflict, having battles, having arguments, and so on. Everyday life like that. However, a relationalist ethos is where you have an idea of this relationship to land itself, the kind of relationship that Aboriginal people and many Indigenous people around the world, of course, but the way we talk about it, that's a relationalist ethos. It's a meaning of life. It's a philosophy of life, actually. Now, the other way of that, the other part of all of this is the idea of survivalism. Survivalism, and as I said, you know, it's always been noted that Aboriginal people are the great survivalists, actually, in this purely this materialist physical terms and understanding about the physical world and so on. Survivalism is you've been through very hard times. It's ordinary. It's like you wouldn't go swimming in shark-infested waters or any kind of generalized danger. Walking across the road and hoping you won't get hit by a bus or something like that. It could be something smaller like that, or something larger, as in war, revolution, all the great events, big crises events throughout history, throughout the world. And while that life might be there and people are experiencing it, the danger is that it might turn into a survivalist ethos, and that is a philosophy of life. And that means if you see these crisis moments or very unhappy moments, sad and so on, you tend to get an idea that this is what the meaning of life is about. And I guess you could say that people are talking about, when they talk about battlers. You know, they tend to think that that's what the life means actually. So all of these terms that everyone's familiar with, the idea of that life is like a dog eat dog world. Society out there is it's a jungle, and you have to look after number one first. So you put yourself and your family or your community or your state, your country first before everybody else. You look after it or them first, or yourself first. That's a survivalist ethos. So you are like, you become like, you or a state becomes like a discrete entity, a conscious isolate, alone in the world, and the environment, whatever the environment is, becomes a hostile environment. It's just normally hostile all the time. So you have to arm yourself, sometimes physically, materially, psychologically, even spiritually, and so on and so on. I think this is where the rising of ideology and religion comes from, actually, because it's an absolutist thinking. So to have a survivalist ethos, you have to have an absolutist thinking that protects you. And so Aboriginal people, it seems, don't have that. It's a bit like that. Most people, they're both relationalist and survivalist, but some people have a relationalist ethos. But too many people and states, you could talk about, have a survivalist ethos. Aboriginal people, like lots of Indigenous people everywhere, they're relationalist ethos people, basically. So they don't see enemies at every step. And the most wonderful thing about it is that we have a capacity for to self-correct, basically. Relationalist ethos people have a capacity to make changes to unfortunate things that have happened to us. But survivalist ethos people find it very, very difficult to broaden, or to even have a reasonably sized capacity to self-correct. And that's why I just know that this regenerative songlines is going to be a great success. I'm not one for foretelling things too much, but you can read, as Aboriginal people are expert at, reading the signs, because we're sticking with our relationalist ethos. We're sticking with it, and that's the underpinning, basically, of regenerative songlines and so on. You have to have a capacity for self-correction. And of course, an individual can have this too, but I'm talking mainly about communities and states. They have to be pretty good at re-looking or understanding policy making, development, a rational analysis. You have to have all of these things. And people who don't have that, and unfortunately, it looks more and more like settler colonialist countries, which are younger, they find that very hard to keep that kind of capacity. So I'm really, really, really looking forward to the regenerative songlines, because that really is the way of bringing a lot of our own old ways of running the country, because I always see Aboriginal people as owners and runners of country. It's been interrupted for 200 years, but we're sort of getting back into this carefully now, and it's time. It really is timely, So I guess I'd like to leave it there if I'm a bit early. Thank you.
Mary, did you want me to bring up some of those other slides that you wanted to speak to the balance?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Because we do have time for further, and I know that you're very mindful of your time, but we're all very delighted to have you. So just let me share screen.
I always make this problem of finishing too early or finishing too late, because I tend to rave on a bit.
Never.
So this diagram, this is how I saw it in a diagrammatic kind of way of that land is the central thing. It's the central thing of people's existence, absolutely. So place and origins, and the four main attributes are ethics, or empathy, if you like. Empathy is a fluid in the brain, they found in science. So you've got to work on it. I think Aboriginal people, they mightn't have known about this thing in the brain, but they certainly knew that you have to work constantly on empathy. Another word for it could be autonomous regard. Autonomous regard. We are autonomous beings, and we see other people as autonomous beings, and yet we have to pursue relationalism. We have to. Sounds contradictory, but it isn't. Another attribute is to autonomy. Women are definitely autonomous beings. So they're together, a gendered relationship, a gendered governance. That was the norm, and balance in all things. Again, a gendered governance, as we say. I think even a gendered logic, actually, myself. But another one is, of course, place. Place is extremely important. The old French guy, Descartes, talking about, I think, therefore I am. Our version of it is, I am located, therefore I am. We are located in a place. And that's what makes us, that's what the meaning of life is, and so on and so on. So all these things are connected up, all of them. The other thing of balance too is to do with governance itself, this is why we're a civilizational culture, not a civilizational state. With a small s, we didn't need a civilizational state. We had a self-regulating state, basically, a culture, I mean. So you didn't need a state. You don't need armies and police to order people what to do. In fact, you simply can't do that, although you have to have authority, and that's knowledgeable people, quite often elders, more often than not elders, but younger people, very, very smart, very knowing, experienced too, but just, very knowledgeable. So the separation of authority and power is how Aboriginal people last, part of the reason why we last so long, why we lasted in such a stable sense, a stable social and political ordering sense, because they separate most other old cultures, they join those two things together, actually. And so that's how you end up with hierarchies rather than lateral systems or heterarchy, a flat system of governance. So it's just all very different, and long-standing. All the things all these words that are usually never associated with Aboriginal people, like they're highly efficient. Efficient in a whole range of ways, not just looking after the land. That's incredibly efficient, but in the social and political ordering, very efficient. Rational, a true meritocracy, an authentic meritocracy. You have knowledgeable people who know how to behave, who conduct themselves, and so on and so on. That's the people ideal that you have to run a place, run a country. So there's a whole range of things that Aboriginal people have to show, but now we can do it, as many Aboriginal people say, walking together, a two-way kind of living in this country. We can become actually, one great offshoot would be that we'd become countrymen, all of us, black and white, actual countrymen, we haven't started yet, because this country is still too much in the colonialist state of mind. But as soon as they, broaden that capacity for self-correction, we'll get on a great deal more. And of course, it goes without saying that Aboriginal people should run Aboriginal affairs, because we're probably the oldest people in the world who have run a country. So, you know. So we should get back to it. We could teach Australians a lot about how to run a country. And starting off with regenerative songlines is the way to do it, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mary. Before we go to hand over to Tyson, I thought we had a couple of hands up. If anyone has questions, we will try our best to put them together. But can you please write them in the Q&A? In a webinar format, it's too easy to lose them in the chat. So if you did have your hand up, you might need to pop your question in the Q&A. Okay, we have one quick question from Dan. What is meant by self-correction?
Self-correction. I think it's a broader idea of like self-improvement, or because it's the really important word is the capacity for this. You could say, you could point to different things, like, for example, the law of obligation. This is this idea of reciprocity and so on. You can look at things in Western society too that is actually there, but from our point of view, we would recognize it as a law of obligation, or this capacity to correct. The National Health Service. The National Health Service that the English, the UK invented about 50 or 70 years ago or whatever, the idea of looking after everybody, no matter how poor, looking at, and it's free, very good quality healthcare for everybody. So turning away from that harsh, cruel sort of system, social, political system, about health, just to do with health. The National Health Service is a brilliant thing. It is adhering, from our point of view, it would be adhering to a law of obligation. You're obliged to look after everybody. If you're going to have a state, well, look after everyone. Don't pick and choose only people at a higher level and give them everything and ignore the poor and the homeless and so on and so on. So that would be just one example of a kind of self-correction. But self-correction nowadays, it could be a range of things. A different, fair way of running an economy, a fair way of running an economy. And the main self-correction, I would say, is working out this way of where Aboriginal people are running Aboriginal affairs. That's what I would do if we were self-correcting. If there was a department of self-correction, if there was such a thing, that's the first thing I would do. And of course, all of the environmental, everything to do with the looking after the environment. That would be self-correction.
Wonderful. Another great question. I'm from anonymous attendee. I'm super interested in the separation of authority and power. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I think it comes from this idea of a survivalist ethos. Apparently, as society's changed, especially if you want to go right into the thing of different timeframes, like from when agriculture starts, around about 10,000 years ago. And when I say agriculture, I'm not getting into this argument between Mr. Pascoe and the anthropologist, I think, I can't think of his name, arguing about that. But large-scale agriculture never happened here. Bits and pieces of it might have happened, here, in close, in the right kind of land that could hold it, but we could never have, for all kinds of factors, the absence of domesticatable animals, driest continent on Earth. We didn't have any things like large, what are they called, delta systems? The Nile River, that's why it's famous, great big delta system. It could afford to have large-scale agriculture and all that. So as soon as it turned like that 10,000 years ago, before they might have had loose hierarchies, chieftains or something like that. After that, people started to fight over land, and then it turned into rigid hierarchies. So they start big, serious competitiveness, wars break out, and so on. And in order to maintain all of that, You have to have a different system, political and social system. You have to start having authority and power in one hand, in one group's hand, a powerful person, powerful family, powerful tribe overriding everybody else. All of that never happened here in this country. No, we never did. So, and of course, if that's a powerful group, you know, pharaoh, emperor, royalty, very rich people, it carries on today. You know, nowadays it'll be somebody like, I don't know, Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or somebody, you know, the richest people in the world, the 1%, they run everything. I mean, you know, you might want to argue about that, but if you want to look at economics and politics, you know, it's pretty well clear that that's the way it is. So all of power and authority is in the hands of one group, one person, what's the name? Aboriginal people parted that, because that's where that's why they didn't end up with a hierarchy. You end up with a flat society and a flat structure, I should say, governance structure. And the beauty, although it's hard, the beauty about a flat structure is everybody has to work harder at getting on. That's simply what it is. And we already have a custodial ethic that tells us how to get on with each other. So we collaborate, we work together on looking after that great Murray-Darling, the Murray-Darling, you know, all these great river systems, which Anne will also, you know, she'll talk about this later. You collaborate on working on these things. So that's a governance system too. It's not just, it's environmental, of course, but it's, and it's the law. That's the whole, and we'll talk more about that later too. So there's all kinds of reasons. Essentially it's a self-regulating system, self-regulating. And that's, some people, some political science people might say that's impossible. You know, how could you avoid big wars and so on and so on? Well, it helps to have a system which says you may have conflicts, only a certain kind of conflicts or a certain amount of conflicts, but don't go around invading other people's country. And this is probably the most unique country in the world which had a general rule like that. Don't go around invading and taking over other people's country, you know. But you can fight, you can have a fight, that's all right, have a disagreement and have all these wonderful protocol kind of things that, you know, activities and so on, that lessens the amount of it. Very, very down to earth, very grounded system, old system, you know, and people quite often want to say it's very full of wisdom and so on. I think it's actually simply full of common sense. You know, you want to, you know, think of yourselves, a group of people stranded on an island. Well, how are you going to get on before you get rescued, you know? If you get rescued, you just have to work that out. It just happened to be a great big island continent. Yes.
Wonderful. Mary, we've got time for one last question. Lizzie has asked, or she said, thank you. And I'd like to explore more about what it means to become countrymen. What is to be done and learned and experienced and thought about?
Well, it's actually literally like what Anne talks about, the regenerative songlines. It's bringing people together to heal the country, which is what the, you know, NAIDOC theme is now. Healing the country isn't just environmentalism. It's when you heal the country, you know, as Anne will, I'm sure, talk about like this, we're looking after ourselves, actually. Now, not just in a selfish, materialist, physical way. We're setting ourselves in the right path, the right mindset again. And you can't do it without looking after the land, you know, that's all. It's all quite straightforward, really.
Thank you, Mary. And in fact, because you were so succinct, there's one other connected question. Ria has asked, how do you see non-Indigenous people becoming located, connected to country?
Oh, gee, I don't know. I think a whole lot of Aboriginal people will have an idea about that, according to their experience with whitefellas too, and government and things like that. But I would hope myself, just a personal opinion, is that they would start to look after their own area. Their own area. Don't be ideological about it necessarily, you know, and see it as it's a positive, good thing to do. It's not about arguing the fact about it. So have it in schools. Of course, I reckon Aboriginal culture and philosophy should be in schools. Every school across the country should have as a subject philosophy, and joining with that the Aboriginal idea of looking after land, or Aboriginal philosophy, if you like. They have to start thinking and doing.
Yes. We've got a number of other terrific questions. I might actually work the lunch break, Mary. We might quietly answer some of those and write them. But could I please invite you all to do a wonderful big thank you for Mary, whether it's a big daddy air clap or you press the little button to say thank you. Can I just give a plug?
Thank you.
Mary Graham is available through Future Dreaming workshops, either every month, second month, and you can have extended time with Mary talking about these important issues, and we'll try to answer some of those other questions. But thank you, Mary. There's some wonderful comments and feedback there. People are very, very appreciative of your time.
Thank you.
We're hearing from Mary again in another session shortly. So thank you, everyone. And thanks again, Mary.
Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce Tyson Yunkaporta. For many people who've read his book or are familiar with his remarkable insights in Sandtalk, he doesn't really need an introduction. But what I'd like to do is invite Tyson to introduce himself in the appropriate way, and we'll bring him up now. So over to you, Tyson. Thank you so much.
Well, look, I mean, it's so appropriate to acknowledge everything that Anne was just talking about. You know, in particular, you know, that most beautiful thing in our culture where, you know, nobody's boss or big boss or anything like that. And that you can have this remarkable experience of having a senior woman speak, and then suddenly, you know, a young person of very low cultural status like myself is able to speak, you know, quite confidently and comfortably immediately following that. And it's not jarring because everybody's voice is here. So, you know, I'm just I'm a boy, an Upledge boy. I just actually got back from going back up home to take care of some family business. So I'm feeling, I'm feeling sort of reconnected because it's about 3,500 kilometers away up on Western Cape there. Yunkaporta family is a very big family. And, you know, we often have a lot of things we have to deal with in the family. So it's, you know, going home is never a holiday. There's always 1,000 things to be done. So I'm a bit tired. My brain's not working very well. But it's very easy to follow from, you know, such wisdom. And of course, you know, a person like myself doesn't have any wisdom yet. But there are interesting ideas if we respect the cultural authority of our elders and we build upon the foundations of what they're saying. So I can only seek to do that today, which is, it's so easy to do. It's like falling off a log and it's just lovely and the ideas just flow. And really, essentially, that's all that book that I wrote was about. And I guess this kind of gives a lot of people hope because they feel that, well, it's not, there's this idea from the Western side that it's also inaccessible, all this Indigenous wisdom. Like, how can I have that? How can I own that, be that, belong to that? So many people from around Australia, you know, have the will. There is a critical mass of people who have the cultural desire to reconnect, you know, with their role as a custodial species. But how can they do that without transgressing and, you know, do the right thing? And I guess it would be about following the lead of, I mean, the most junior among us, you know, the children, the young people, the uninitiated, you know, the people who are still in that foundational learning role like myself. I guess that would be your point of entry, would be to follow the protocols that you see unfolding there. And I tell you, it's not, you don't feel this desire to, I need to gain that wisdom. I need to, you know, you don't have that desire to accumulate knowledge. You know, you're happy to have story that someone hands you and then sit with that and just beautify that in the relationship between you. And you're more than happy to do that, which, you know, I always am. yeah, as soon as you get out of that rivalrous dynamic of knowledge and of ownership and all this kind of thing, you'd be surprised how many amazing ideas can fall out of just a tiny amount of knowledge. They're just infinite combinatorials. So because my brain isn't working properly, I can just offer a couple of quick stories from the last 24 hours that sort of build on the foundations of what Anne's just said. And so I was asked yesterday by somebody who was in the role of designing roads and rail infrastructure. They were asking, how can I bring Indigenous knowledge, and Indigenous sort of systems thinking, how can I bring that to my role? How can we bring that to the role of developing, roads and bridges and railways? How I don't know. And I think he had this notion of that he was going to paint up and do a corroboree or something on the side of the road, or, somehow this kind of thing coming through. And, and he was sort of saying, I feel like I'd be appropriating knowledge if I, bring in those token sort of things into my work. And then what real good would it do for the roads and all that sort of thing? And, I said to him, well, you could just quite simply take, learn from an Indigenous view of deep time, an Indigenous deep time view of planning, and start to apply that, start to apply a holistic way of thinking where you're considering all the variables over a deeper period of time. So not just over the next 5 years or so, but over the next 50, over the next 200 years, the next 500 years, what is that going to look like? These roads that you're building, these rails that you're building, if you come from remote Australia, you'd be familiar with all those abandoned, rusted out railway lines that a lot of people had to do a lot of forced labor on, and a lot of different kinds of infrastructure like bridges. All over Western New South Wales, you see this, that are all just sort of rusting out now. So these were people who were planning infrastructure for current trends. They were looking at a current economy and building according to that. They were looking at a big L curve of growth that was happening, and they just projected along that L curve without considering much. So I was offering, and I can't go into all of it because it took a long time, but I offered all of the things that this person would need to look at. They'd need to look quite intensively at Australia's relationship with China and what China's current policies are with regards to being dependent on Australia for iron ore. They deeply resent that, and they're trying to find a loophole to get out of that so that they can get that iron ore from somewhere else. And basically, that's the only thing. Iron ore and coal for China is the only thing that's keeping Australia as a first world economy at the moment. So things are going to change pretty drastically as soon as they can wiggle their way out of that. And our relationship is not exactly improving. So that's just one thing, but there are so many things. If you look at what was revealed during COVID about how fragile all these massive big supply chains are, what was revealed with the fires and with the big fish die-offs down the Murray-Darling Basin, all of these things, the water just disappearing, all of these things going on, where the food bowls are, but where the food bowls are going to be, whether there is going to be food bowls where you can have mass production. Also, the roads you're building for traffic, like at the moment, yes, the amount of cars are still growing all the time, but you can't just project that into the future for the next 50 years, because I can guarantee you that in 50 years, there won't be that many cars, if any. I can't imagine cars in their current form will still be around within a few decades at all. It's going to be something very different. So any infrastructure that you develop will have to be something that's kind of agile and that can be repurposed as you go for different kinds of things. What kind of economies are going to need to emerge with the massive cataclysms, economic and ecological and in every other way, social, as these supply chains continue to break down, as the sort of degrowth movement grows, as the big push towards decentralization grows, which it will continue to increase over time, So from an Indigenous perspective, you see all of these things, and you need to think, well, what are the economies that are going to emerge, and what will be the supply chains that will emerge alongside that? Like, obviously, people are going to have to move just to survive, are going to have to move to much more local economies. They're going to have to move particularly to much more local food production, but that still won't be enough. So there will still need to be trade, and there will still need to be supply. But, you know, all these regions will have to be quite interdependent and syndicated as we go along, so that people are exchanging from one local region to the next adjacent, and then over distance like that. But it'll have to be in a series of small hops. So how would you remake that, the infrastructure of roads? I also asked him to consider how many of the highways in Australia are built on songlines, and the trade routes that go along with these songlines, you know, because those roads, you look at the Bruce Highway, for example, in Queensland, all these roads were already there when the settlers arrived. They just started riding their horses and wagons along those, and gradually, of course, widened them so that two wagons could pass each other. And then gradually, of course, that, you know, turned into bitumen roads. But those things are still songlines. Those things are still, you know, trade routes. So the maps and the patterns are all there, and the paths and the songlines and trade routes and everything else that are needed for, you know, the syndication of a lot of different local regional governments and trade, you know, across these sort of syndicated, you know, relational entities over time. Yeah, this will have to be emergent. And I guess as we continue to regenerate these songlines, I think they'll have more and more significance. So that's in a nutshell how I responded to that person. And I think he probably had to go away and have like 12 hours sleep and a bowl of Wheaties after that one, because, you know, cognition at that level tends to burn up a lot of energy. That's why we tend to do it in groups, because it's taxing for one brain to try and consider these things. I guess this comes back to that self-correction principle as well. You know, there's this self idea all the time. It's the wrong word. You know, this self-correction, this idea, and Arnie sort of said it's not quite, you know, self-improvement, self-development, all this sort of thing. Basically, we all live in these, you know, as human beings and as a custodial species, we live in social systems, you know, and those are regenerative. And they're self-determining. Self-determination doesn't mean just making another nation based on this system of nations that's only about a century old. You know, self-determination is about what they might call in science autopoiesis, the way a system organizes itself. It is self-organizing. Now, you are just one node within a self-organizing system, within a social system that is patterned on the landscape where it exists. You're within that, and you're following the patterns of that landscape. And you have a very light touch within that landscape as well, because you're not massively changing the landscape. You're not intervening on a landscape from outside of it. You're in it, you know. So you're part of a system that is organizing itself. So like I said, in science, that's known as autopoiesis. And so those systems self-correct. When problems emerge in that system, you'll find it's just like in your body, like immune responses are organized. There are adaptations that occur. I mean, you don't have to sit there and think about, you know, creating antigens and things like, you don't go, antigens, I need some antigens, like when you're getting an infection or something, you know, you don't think about that. Your body does that. You know, your body self-organizes. Aren't you lucky to be inhabiting that system? You know, and your mind is just a part of that. And it is syndicated out with so many other systems, so many other entities in the landscape. It's absolutely beautiful. Everybody's pretty much already living in and inhabiting all these interconnected systems. It's mostly a matter of being able to see it and to be able to operate in it with that light hand. So I think I've gone for way too long here. Sorry, Aunt. But
not at all, Tyson.
If there's any questions you want to get back to for Arnie there too. And,
Well, I've actually got a question I'd love to put to you and then to Mary. We've
All
got
right.
a couple of questions coming up about totems and moieties. And one of the questions is, what's the importance of moieties? I hope I'm saying that right. Or defined roles within the community. And others are asking, totems, would it help if non-connected to totems? There's a lot of skepticism about this. So we'd love you to hear your thoughts on, and I think this is connecting very much to the non-Indigenous hunger to connect to place. So it's an important question, I think.
Well, I can finish up with that as well.
Please
And
do.
it's and then that way, then Arnie can give the proper sort of big view on that. But if we go start from the 101 entry level sort of thing now, you know, I think, well, for a start, the totemic stuff, that's about making sure that your social system is patterned on the natural system, or what we call natural system now. You know, it's patterned on the system in the landscape, you know, that it's patterned on your local environment. So, you know, I mean, there might be people who live in places that don't have bandicoots, but you need bandicoot people in this particular place. You see what I mean? So it's make sure that your community is patterned on the law of the land. That's what the totemic system does, and Arnie can give more information on that. But then I think as for the rest of it with moieties, for me, and that just might be my lens on it, for me, it's about, you know, that's always amongst like the first law in creation that's handed down to people. You know, when the people are still sort of, they don't have the knowledge yet, and those creator beings instill that knowledge. One of the first things is that, I mean, what we call kinship system now, but I think there's the core of that is like the big problem of you can't just anyway marry. You know, you can't just marry anybody, whoever. You don't walk around in the world falling in love with people and then running off. How's that working out for everybody? What is it, like 80, 90% now those marriages fail? It's not working. Stop it. Stop falling in love and choosing your own partner. Listen to your parents, for God's sake. But well, so the moieties are there to make sure that, you know, you're marrying the right way, and you're marrying the right way to make sure that both cultural and genetic vigor can be maintained over time in a small population, because you need to maintain small populations in your region, but you need to have genetic vigor. You don't want to end up ding ding ding. You know, it's because you go there if you just let anybody marry anybody. So that's what that's all about, and that is a beautiful algorithm. I mean, at the moment we're working on a project where we're looking at genetic computing. It's like genetic computing algorithms. That's like the big hope for artificial intelligence and for neural nets and all this sort of stuff. So basically, they have these algorithms that are patterned on human DNA, that they follow that, and they can do amazing things. And what they do is they make them breed. So they split them and splice them. But as always, they always marry. They've got this survival of the fittest thing. That survivalist mentality goes to everything. And so the robots won't work out because they keep like just picking the best ones and mating them together. And so what keeps happening with this genetic computing is that they just all atrophy, and they all end up ding ding ding, and after generations they all fall apart. So we're looking at a program where we're applying a marriage law algorithm to how these genetic computing algorithms can mate. And then that will provide the algorithms that will make a neural net that will work. And then we want to use that neural net to make an agent-based modeling software in which the country that all the agents are on is also a sentient agent. And that requires more computational power. But we're stuck because at the moment we're just going through the protocols of it and the ethics. And from an Indigenous viewpoint, we're asking, okay, we can do it. We can do it, and we've tried it, and it will work. However, should we do it? And we're thinking that'll probably take us about another 10 years to figure that out, whether we should do it or not. And I guess it's that sort of slow consideration of things, because I mean, a powerful neural net will have a massive knock-on effect for many systems all around the world, and we're not sure whether or not we want to unleash that on the planet. So I don't know, Annie, what do you think for moieties, totems, everything?
Oh, look, I couldn't explain it better. just did that perfectly. I'd rather actually not go into all that. See, I mean, myself, I feel a bit sort of wanting, you know what I mean, like not able to. But you explained that, I thought, really wonderfully, and you know, I thought that was pretty good.
Sweet.
Could I just actually add to that, taking all that into account? I think of it like, if people are familiar with the term about having a steady state system, it's usually in chemistry. I think Aboriginal people, but Indigenous people everywhere, saw this outside, you know, outside. It's not outside, we're in it too, but nature itself or environment is a steady state system. And they tried to more or less copy this in all of its complexity and everything, right down to marriage and so on, you know. But so we have to have a kind of look for a steady state social and political ordering system, basically, that matches that. Do you know what I mean? And as little I know about actual chemistry, when you have a steady state system, it can deal with any kind of interruption, attack, all kinds of upside down. It could turn upside down, like, but then it just writes itself back up again, and it might steady like this and then be right, you know, and just stay like that. And that's the beauty I saw about the regenerative songlines. It's like that. It's like, this is the way we'll steady this ship again, you know, this ship like this. And speaking of autonomous, marriage, a friend of mine, I'll just tell you, it's a very small story. A friend of mine, he's a retired philosopher, Peter Wertheim. He was telling a story about a mathematician professor telling him a story about they were trying to figure out a problem, would you believe, in maths. This is a European, so a problem in maths that had been a problem for about 300 years or something. So they had all these mathematicians trying to figure it out, you know, figure it out. And eventually they did, in the modern era, figure it out. But this professor said, if we'd have understood about the Aboriginal kinship system, we would have solved it long ago. And I mean, that's how complex it is. The kinship system is so beautifully, it's beautiful and elegant and correct and steady like that, you know. So you could have small societies, small groups, I mean, societies full of small groups, and no what they call consanguinity, the intermarriage, you know, interbreeding, I should say. You know, you don't have it. And it's important. They wondered how could that possibly happen? But that's because this kinship system was so perfectly worked out. High mathematics, you know, and this is what this mathematician said, you know. So they sold it. They could have sold it earlier if they'd have known it. It's amazing. Anyway, thanks, Tyson. That was fantastic.
It's amazing. Well, in the spirit of keeping our biological systems in balance, given we've got a long day listening to Zoom and chatting, perhaps we can now have our break. We've scheduled a break from 11 till 11:15. So what we might do is a huge thank you to Tyson Yunkaporta. And someone actually made the comment, Tyson, if this is your brain working in slow motion, because they can't wait to see you when it's full on, because that was...
Yes. It'll truly zoom.
I always do my best thinking when I'm piggybacking off Auntie. So.
Lovely.
Oh,
I've also plugged your book in the chat, so if you haven't had a look at Tyson's book, Sandtalk, you can read it, you can listen to it, and I'm sure that if you have a little Google around, you'll find more wonderful discussions from Tyson. Can I invite a seriously deep thank you to Tyson for making the time. I know how busy you are, and that it's a delight to see you here with your elders and colleagues.